We start the video with a short film clip showing the first three classes of people and the way they were smartly dressed, along with their lifestyle. From here we need to go behind the scenes to an existence similar to that of a third world country. We have a scene from Reading Town Centre showing some sort of celebration. The people are very smartly dressed, with women in skirts and blouses and men in suits. It seems the fashion of the day was straw boater hats that everyone is wearing. We now turn to the opulence of the upper class of people, with this image of Mr. McIlroy's department store on the corner of Cheapside and Oxford Street. It shows no expense was spared in the construction of this building and also shows the status of Mr. McIlroy himself. We now move down to the middle and working class of people, showing the managers and workers of the factory towns and also the policeman in uniform in the background. This is a sharp contrast from the previous videos and images. I do not understand why men and boys were dressed in suits unless it was the uniform of the workforce set out by the owners, and women and girls with shawls over their heads. The video gives a view of how disputes were settled, with the two young men fighting and nobody caring about it. We now come down to the lowest level of the class system, namely court living, and to this video showing the area of the Coley Courts, which begins with where I am standing now in Wolseley Street to the boundary of Field Road, with houses accommodating thousands of people. Coley Passage leading to the Coley Steps would be in front of me, with the courts leading off. To see how green it is now to the pollution and smell in 1932 is a complete contrast. As the Industrial Revolution gathered pace, housing was needed for more and more workers. Some landlords seized the opportunity to exploit the situation. They made their profits by cramming as many poorly built houses into a small space as possible. Such cramped, squalid living conditions proved the perfect breeding ground for disease. This map illustrates the density of the housing of the courts and was drawn up at the time of the demolition by Reading Borough Council. The occupants were moved out in their hundreds using handcarts to the estates of Whitley, Tilehurst and Caversham. Looking at this picture of Castle Street, if you could turn to the right you would be facing Coley Place, one of the only two entrances to the famous Coley Steps. This gave access to the back-to-back houses of the courts. We start this video with a short introduction by my friend and colleague Mr. Joe Doak, and here he is.
Here's an aerial shot from about 1925, with Castle Street to the left and Bowsier Square ringed. The square was located between Coley Place at the bottom of the circle and Coley Street at the top of the circle. Bowsier Square was one of the areas of poor quality housing built in the mid-1800s, which housed the growing industrial workforce of Reading. This lithograph by Cyril Pearce was produced in the 1920s and shows the adjoining Coley Steps, renowned as the core of Old Coley. All the courts of the steps and Bowsier Square were demolished in the 1930s. This photo takes us forward in time to the present day. It's a shot from Google Earth, and it shows the area that was Bowsier Square, circled, and the Coley steps running down to the right of the footbridge over the IDR. Times move on, but the remnants of history leave their mark, either in the street names, old buildings, or lines on the ground.
This aerial photo, taken in the 1920s, shows the complete area of the courts. We can again see Castle Street to the left and the Blue Lion Public House to the far right. It is now possible to see the clean building lines of the houses in Bright and Parnell Streets in the top right corner, compared to the complete mess on the Coley Courts. I have here a letter written by Mr. William Benton to the Reading Chronicle. It details his life on the Coley steps and the hardship he suffered. And it starts, those early days from the turn of the century, my boyhood days in Coley, were certainly hard and bitter for the working population. The appalling poverty, and I speak from experience, having been born, bred and educated under the most distressing conditions, could not be envisaged by the people of the 21st century. Our hunger was often acute, in fact so acute that I unashamedly admit I ate dog biscuits. I remember my grandmother once seeing me stripped to be washed, saying, "His bones are coming through his skin," and she wept so much that I wondered what she was going on, especially as my mother said, "What a world for him to grow up in. It would have been merciful for him to be taken from us at birth." For all this seemed that there was no group of people strong enough to lift us from our plight or despair. Our only friends were our own people, who often shared their meagre rations with others. Often my mother went without just to feed her brood. But we saw the tears she often tried to hide. To supplement our food sources, I remember so well going on Saturday evenings to the open market and retrieving damaged potatoes and fruit lying in the gutters. To us this was luxury. In those days disease was rife and our conditions of living did not help. If a doctor was called, he would not look at a patient unless 1 shilling and sixpence in old money was on the table. There was hardly a family without at least one member of the family suffering, as it was called then, consumption. It was commonplace to see children deformed with rickets through malnutrition, measles, whooping cough, ringworm, diphtheria, scarlet fever. They were all there, and a number of my friends died early through one or other of these diseases that were so common to us. Of course, we must not overlook another great discomfort we had to bear, that of housing conditions. The area where I lived as a boy was made up of narrow courts and alleys, and ironically enough of these were named after trees: Elder Court, Ivy Court, Pine Court, and so on. These hovels were so terribly overcrowded there was only one fresh water tap and one toilet, usually a fair way off, between 6 to 8 houses, and clothes washing facilities consisted of one cast iron boiler under a rusty tin roof. However, we did keep clean. I beg to say that we did. Many times I stripped to the waist despite the weather, and we looked on it as fun in the winter when a fire was lit on around the tap to thaw it out, sometimes resulting in a flood. But from spring to autumn the rivers were our enjoyment. The waters of the Kennet and Holy Brook were sparkling indeed. One could always see the gravel bottom and shoals of minnows and dace. In many cases, should I say most, the hovels were infested with rats, and the only thing being well fed were the cats, on account of the swarms of mice. To add a bit more discomfort, there was the other vermin, bedbugs, fleas, and another very unwelcome guest, the headlouse. Flies were around in swarms during the warm weather, and I remember running a competition to see how many flies we could get stuck onto the fly paper, a gummy strip hanging from the ceiling. All this must not be attributed to us. We were not filthy people, far from it. One only had to see the well-scrubbed tables and floors and the black-leaded grates to dispel this myth. Much of the trouble was brought about by so-called landlords who did little or nothing to improve their property. I knew of one such gentleman who repaired the bedroom floors with fish boxes because he could get them free from the fishmongers. Our walls were just coloured limewash, and the authorities did nothing to alleviate our plight. It was to be some years before any of this was to change. Looking back now, I think it wasn't our education that gave us something to cling to. Our learning was very strict indeed, and we were taught as the prime subjects reading, writing and arithmetic, and were told that from these more knowledge would unfold. How true I found that to be. Many of us read books on history and travel, and somehow in our young minds we hoped that one day we could perhaps change or get rid of the conditions in which we lived. How I bless and thank those men and women who were our teachers. They brightened our lives and showed us great patience. We in turn gave them great respect. It was them who inspired us to seek more knowledge. Amid all our adversities of our lives, we made ourselves happy as children do. We fished, went swimming, sometimes with disaster and ending up with a parental belting. At school we enjoyed things like May Day celebrations and Empire Day, when we were taught the sun never set on the British Empire. We kept tradition alive by singing patriotic songs and saluting the Union Jack. All of this with enthusiasm, because we were reminded we were British, but we were more concerned with the half day that was to follow. Looking at this image, it shows Elm Court in the foreground with the Blue Lion in the distance. Of the 4 houses of the court, 2 were owned by Mr. Bewley and Mr. Aldridge until they were demolished in the 1930s. To gain access to the front of the houses, you would need to go through the doorway by the lamp. These houses were of the back-to-back type, and on the side closest to the Blue Lion there were no rear windows and no doorways. The pathway in front of the lamp was a pathway which led to the Coley School playground, which children would use to go to and fro from their homes. This last image shows the final demolition of the Coley Steps and the area just before the construction of the IDR in 1969. It is ironic to me, looking at this photo, as this was my playground, not knowing that in the area to the right of the steps, by the top street lamp, once stood the home of my great-grandmother and grandfather Philip and Sophie Jewell, who lived at 7 Hazel Court. The next piece of film is a narration outlining the hardship and life of living in the courts. It is a general view of people and houses in this category across the country.
Poverty is very acute in my district. I was making visits from door to door a few weeks ago in a short street containing only 12 houses. I saw 6 families in a state of semi-starvation. There was one house shared by 2 families. The husbands out of work, no food, no fire, children crying most bitterly. One of the children, aged about 7, but old-looking, was pinched with hunger, faint from want of nourishment.
A woman making matchboxes. According to Galt's notes, she worked 16 hours a day and got 2.5 pence per gross of boxes. This one's another home industry, mattress stuffing. You got 1 shilling per mattress. This one's extraordinary, the detail on the faces. They're blacksmiths, the man and the woman. They made household shovels and dustpans, mostly from scrap.
The early sociologist Seabohm Rowntree calculated that to feed and clothe your family at a subsistence level, no luxuries at all, you needed 21 shillings, 8 pence a week. If you stayed in health and in work, 21 shillings was about average. But the trouble was, there was no safety net for the bad times. If you fell sick, if you lost your job, there was no system of social security on which to fall back. In old age, if you put no money aside, you had nothing. And times were getting harder. In the early years of the 20th century, wages were stagnant, prices and unemployment were on the rise.
Now, at first glance, this might look like any other ordinary sort of set of terraced houses, but it's not. In fact, this is incredibly rare because it's the last remaining example of a style of living which has more or less been forgotten about. Yet at one point in our history, most people that lived and worked in industrial towns and cities in England lived in accommodation like this, back to back.
Now, I know what you're thinking, but our understanding of the term back-to-back has changed over the years. It's now applied to Coronation Street-style houses, but it actually refers to something very specific. These houses weren't just attached to their neighbours on either side. The back walls were also shared. One house was built literally onto the back of another. They sprung up in their tens of thousands at the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century.
They were as much a part of the Industrial Revolution as anything that was manufactured in the factories and workshops. And when thousands of people flocked to the towns and cities looking for work, property speculators saw an opportunity and a building frenzy began. By 1850, 2/3 of Birmingham's population lived in courts just like this one.
Today, this is all that remains of this once common type of housing. It was fully restored by the Birmingham Conservation Trust and the National Trust back in 2000. Chris Upton was the historian involved with the project.
So is this typical of most back-to-back courts?
Yeah, sure. They're clustered around a yard.
Yeah.
There's one entrance and one exit, which could be tricky in a fire.
Yeah.
They're real fire hazards. And there's 11 houses here. Some of them had half a dozen, some of them 20, 30 houses.
Right.
Depending on the plot of land the developer had, how many houses he could squeeze in on it. And
I
there'd
guess
be another court next door and another one beyond that. They weren't everywhere. You don't find them in London. You didn't find them in the northeast. It's that middle bit of the country. Manchester, Liverpool, Hull, Leeds, down to Birmingham was back-to-back living. It's tenements if you get further north and further south.
what would it have been like in its day?
It was described as living at the bottom of a well sometimes because not much light gets in.
No,
The
and if there
walls
was
are
light,
high.
it'd be full of smog up there, probably.
Well, that's right.
In
as
industrial
well.
England.
Yeah, yeah.
In this particular court, how many people lived?
At most, 65 is the highest I've found.
But obviously there's no loos inside, so there's
No.
only 3 outside loos for 60-odd people.
Yeah, they could be death traps because the water supply and the toilets are worryingly close to each other.
Sure.
And, so people did pick things up, and once an epidemic got into a court,
It was
measles or
rife.
something, it ran round fast. So they were thought of as very unhealthy places, even though the people enjoyed living in them.
Can we go inside and have a look?
Yeah, sure. This way.
Hey, do you know what? It feels like we've landed right in the middle of the Victorian era.
And we have, in about 1870.
So how many people would have lived in this particular house then?
Well, this was the home of the Oldfield family, and there was Mr. and Mrs. Oldfield, and their 8 children,
Wow.
and a lodger, and the lodger's girlfriend, with 2
So a lot
bedrooms.
of people. I was just going to say it, but it's only 2 bedrooms.
Yeah.
Where did most of the people come from to rent these places?
All over the country and abroad. So there was a Jewish community, there were quite a few Italians, there were a lot of Irish, Scots, but the majority are from the surrounding countryside.
Coming in wanting to work in the factories.
Yeah.
People were lured to the towns by better wages and guaranteed work, but the effect on their health was undeniable.
So what was the average life expectancy?
It's difficult to answer that, Paul, but it depends very much which street you lived in,
right,
and which area you lived in. If you lived in what we'd now call the suburbs of Birmingham, you know, only a mile or two out, your life expectancy was double what it would be right in the centre. There were streets in central Birmingham where half the children would die before the age of 5.
National legislation had banned the building of new courts way back in 1870, and local authorities were encouraged to demolish them. For cities like Birmingham, it would prove a monumental challenge. By the end of the First World War, the city still had more than 43,000 back-to-backs. In fact, some people still lived in them right up to the 1970s, a whole 100 years after the ban.
Why did it take such a long time to knock them all down then?
Just the sheer number of them. I mean, there were 10,000 courts, so you couldn't put that many people onto the housing market at the same time.
You couldn't rehouse them. Well, thank goodness this one survived. What was it about this one?
Really, I think it was accident. It's mostly a commercial street, her street, and I think that eventually people forgot what they were.
Have you actually chatted to people that lived here? What did they say?
It's very different. If you had a happy family life, you liked the back-to-backs. If you had an unhappy family life, you didn't.
So if the last tenants moved out in the 1960s, you would have known them and spoken to them?
Yes, interviewed them. Yeah.
And what were their recollections of the place then?
They leave with excitement and then very quickly realise that they've lost something in the process. They've lost that sense of community, of knowing your neighbours. So it was a trade-off. But the last couple to move out said it was like a little palace to us.
Gosh, that's like stepping back in time. Thank goodness this court has survived demolition, because without it, a very important part of our social history would have disappeared, along with the bricks and mortar. And thankfully, it now remains a living testament to how thousands of people would have lived in industrial towns and cities all over the country. And it's just as valuable to our heritage as those big stately homes.